All right, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. I think there's still a few more people trickling in, but we'll go ahead and get started. Thanks again for joining us. This session is going to be focusing around how you take a more advanced curriculum that may be handed to you that is probably more appropriate for middle or high school students and make it meaningful and applicable to your early learners. So before we jump into the nitty-gritty and hand it over to our esteemed panelists today, we'll go over a little bit of background of who we are and why exactly we do these webinars. So we are Paige and Paxton. We are a line of children's characters that introduce kids 6 and under to STEM. And the reason why we do what we do is because we truly believe in the power of one, which is that if you have one child, it only takes one child and one teacher and one experience to change everything, to change the trajectory of a child's future. And so what we do is we offer materials, training, and then also more recently, Paige and Paxton experiences to focus on increasing STEM awareness in early elementary classrooms. Because we believe that the way to go about changing the trajectory of our children really starts early with educators like you. So right to date, Paige and Paxton materials can be found in 15 different school systems across the country. Some of you tuned in have Paige and Paxton in your classroom. In terms of training, we've trained over 500 early elementary educators to date on early STEM best practices in their classrooms. And then we also more recently have launched Paige and Paxton Experiences, which focus on engaging young minds with hands-on experiences where we bring STEM experts to help young children focus on problem-solving skills, and then also making sure that in addition to those skills, that they're connecting their experience to actual careers that they can enter into in the future. And then as part of that, we offer a webinar series because we know that there is a huge focus on STEM, but unfortunately, there's not a lot of resources available to early childhood educators to figure out what that looks like in the early childhood setting. And so what we do is we curate different experts from across the country who are driving STEM solutions in their schools and classrooms, and we're giving them directly to you guys. So that is one of the ways that we're really trying to help drive and solve the STEM pipeline crisis that we're seeing in this country. So without further ado, I'll go ahead and pass it on to Aditi, who will take it from here.
Okay, excellent. Well, I'm so happy to join you guys today. Thank you so much for tuning in and taking your precious time. I know you all are educators related to education, so all of your time, especially at the end of the year, is precious. I wanted to just give you some quick background about who I am and how I've kind of come to understand and relate to STEM. So my name is Aditi Garg. I am a pre-kindergarten teacher at Mound STEM School, which is a pre-K to 8 traditional district school in Cleveland, Ohio. I teach an integrated classroom, so students with both typicals and students with special needs. And the drive of our classroom and our school in general is really rooted in the idea of STEM learning and STEM at the premise of mastering content and standards. And so I do work with a co-teacher, and we have community partners, and together we have kind of collaborated over and over again on what is the best way to realize STEM learning in an early childhood setting, also while making sure our students are adequately prepared for kindergarten. So that's kind of how I've come about in the STEM world. I'm really passionate about STEM learning. I'm always looking to grow in my own thinking. So I'm excited to be here today to kind of share that process of learning and growing. So we'd love to just get started and dive right in. And so, as Kelly mentioned, kind of the premise of my tutorial today is just to talk through my thinking and my experience of being at a district school that serves this wide range of learners, and being really introduced to STEM through more of a middle school, high school lens thinking, where students come to STEM with a lot more prior knowledge than our students do, and are able to kind of negotiate with materials and ideas at a higher level. So my kind of approach was, how do I bring all this really great inquiry and observation into my classroom and have a product and something to demonstrate my students' learning to the community, which is so important, in a way that's developmentally appropriate. So a little bit about Mound. We are a STEM school, and the STEM initiative was introduced in the Cleveland Public School District about 5 years ago. And so we have about 4 elementary schools that are considered STEM schools, and 2 really high-performing high schools that are STEM schools. One is actually housed at our Great Lakes Science Center, and another on G East campus. So they're really integrated into the community. There's a lot of community investment in getting STEM off the ground and running at our schools. And I would say within the past 3 years, my school has really pushed the focus on not just incorporating STEM as like an extra thing that we do, but really rooting all of our learning in STEM-related inquiry. And so all of these schools are opt-in. We have a school choice kind of system in CMSD. So our parents are very aware of STEM and kind of how that's integrated into the curriculum. I wanted to start off kind of thinking about how early childhood STEM is different from project-based learning. I know that when I have looked at a lot of STEM ideas, it looks a lot like PBL in the sense of, like as early childhood educators, we're always thinking about things like theme, how do things in math relate to things in language and literacy and physical motor and fine motor, and how can we group them under a certain theme. And I think it's kind of easy to think about building a STEM curriculum and thinking like, yes, that's just theme and we're calling it STEM by using technology and science. But I think what I learned from going through the design process and really looking at it on a higher level is saying that theme doesn't necessarily create a context in which students are building those observational skills and asking those WH questions and really building that inquiry. And that's really the push, I think, of STEM in early childhood, is building those inquiry tools through language and through investigation. So I just wanted to name that right off the bat, that was one of the things that I kind of was challenged by at first as an educator, and kind of had to think beyond just the PBL that I know we are all doing in our classrooms very often. So just moving on, I wanted to talk a little bit about the design process specifically. And so what, if it's not PBL, STEM in early childhood, then what is it? And I wanted to really root my thinking in kind of the overall design process that like it happens at a higher level, and then kind of bring it down to how I've adapted it for ECE. And so the next slide kind of provides a framework that all of us at CMSD use. And so from 8th grade down to pre-K, as teachers, we're all kind of asked to go through this 5-step process in our designing our curriculum and in our thinking, and then kind of ask and push our students to do the same. And so I think this was really overwhelming to me as an early childhood educator, because I look at a lot of these things and what I realize is like in step 3, build, and step 4, evaluate. These really rely on a lot of prior knowledge skills that my students might not necessarily have, and I can't guarantee that they have because this is their first school experience in pre-K. So as an educator, I'm looking at things like asking and imagining, and I'm thinking like, yes, we do a lot of that in my classroom in daily activities, but we don't always create and then evaluate. We don't always ask, well, what went wrong or how could we do this differently, because a lot of the things we're doing are for the first time, and we want to make sure that we're building a stable base of prior knowledge. So we want it as educators to work out for the first time so that we can show and demonstrate to students why things happen the way they do. And so that was kind of my big fear, like how are we going to make this work in pre-K, and how are we going to build the prior knowledge that they need, but also have students question that knowledge. And I think a lot of these things just felt like maybe almost not developmentally appropriate, in the sense that like it wouldn't be authentic work to ask our students to do all of these things. But they're definitely capable of having the essence of some of these things if the curriculum was kind of better designed and more targeted and more aligned with early learning best practices. So I kind of took this with my co-teacher, and we have done now like 5 kind of STEM units, I'm going to call them, quarterly units, where it goes beyond 1 or 2 experiences, and it kind of ties a whole STEM inquiry investigation together. And I want to just take kind of like the rest of the time to share how we go about building a STEM curriculum, and a whole STEM kind of elongated experience. So kind of using this framework in mind, we wanted to make some adaptations. So really focus in on what do we want STEM learning to look like in our early childhood classroom. Well, we want it to be observations based, because we know in early childhood we're thinking about things like what 5 senses. We're thinking about things like how do we use our bodies to discover the world around us? And then we're building our language skills. How do we use our language to ask questions about things going on around us? How do we utilize language to get more vocabulary about things happening around us? And at the same time, how do we develop prior knowledge that students will need as a base to move forward? So a really simple example I used is like, when we're testing out like different seeds and how different seeds grow, we want students to understand that seeds need certain things in order to grow. So we want to get across like those key elements that they'll use to kind of test further on in upper grades to kind of build on that thinking. And hopefully through these experiences, they'll gain this framework of asking questions, of testing things, of thinking through how the processes of doing things that will help them as they continue up the grades to understand material. And build a passion for science. I kind of want to add that too, that like, I think we're all here because we know that children are natural scientists and have a natural born curiosity. So like these things that we're doing are all to frame that curiosity and make it as constructive as it can be. So kind of the way that I like to frame and design my ECE STEM projects are through this framework. So I start with a big idea concept, and that kind of looks like the PBL theme. I think it has to be something that is open-ended enough where if you put it into Google, you won't get a solid answer. And so you start with kind of a big tent idea, and then you frame some essential questions that go along with that idea. Again, these questions should be open-ended. They should be related to the big idea, but they should also be things that students are able to investigate, observe, and test, so they can kind of build off of that question and continue to ask their own questions, and you can build answers based on the experiences that you provide. I also like to frame all of this in experiential learning, so beyond like the science projects, the technology use, using math and data and engineering, getting outside of the classroom I think is so important. So going to field trips that are related to whatever your big idea is, or having family members come in and talk if they work in a certain career that has to do that, I think is so important, really grounds what they're learning in the classroom to the real world. And allows that conversation to keep going outside of just this unit. And finally, I think one big push that my school has and that STEM has, I think in the upper grades, is this idea of having a presentation of learning. And I think it's so important for us as teachers to really show students that like through their language and through their projects and through their work, they're able to demonstrate to others how much they're learning and how great they're doing and like how much they're absorbing. So just really I think having a culminating project almost where they can kind of build what they've been learning through little experiences into their own creation and then kind of talk about that creation is like the crux of I think that early childhood aspect. I think it's like the best way that students can talk about their learning is through something that they made and telling them how they made it and what they needed to know in order to make it. So that all is kind of abstract. I realize like without more of a contextual experience. Ooh, I think I went too far. So I wanted to kind of give a concrete example of how this plays out. So the most recent STEM kind of quarterly unit that I designed with my co-teacher was around sound. And we did this for over like a 4-week period. And so our big idea was sound, or what is sound, was kind of the question we posed to our students. And then we had some essential questions. How can we experience sound? How can we make sound with our bodies? And how can we make sound using materials? And over the course of 4 weeks, we created kind of investigations where students could manipulate materials and we could discuss all these different questions and then kind of guide and facilitate in order to find some answers. And I think this is where you have to like negotiate your teacher role and really kind of allow for students to really authentically investigate and maybe things don't work at first, but through asking and facilitating as a guide, you get around to really the crux of the understanding. So when we talked about how can we experience sound, we tested tuning forks, and we talked about how you can feel the tuning fork, feel the vibration. You can also see the vibration when you dunk the tuning forks in water, and if you put it to your ears, you can hear. So it's kind of integrating that 5 senses, and that's how we were investigating sound. Then we moved on and we thought about, well, if we can experience sound, then we should be able to make sound. So we asked that question, like, how can we make sound? And we thought about it in terms, again, of our bodies, so things that we know. Well, we've been studying our bodies. So what can our bodies do to make sound? Well, we can blow into instruments, we can rub or strum things, or we can tap or shake things. And all these things we can do, and we related that to instruments that exist in our room or exist that we've seen in the orchestra or things like that. And we did a little like sorting and math activity about different ways to play instruments. And then finally, we were like, how can we use materials to make our own sound? And so this was kind of the culmination project and a demonstration of learning. I want to make a sound that I blow into, and I know that sound is vibration, and so like how am I going to construct some sort of instrument using my own ideas, but knowing that the sound have to have a vessel which I can blow, so it has to have a hole and things like that we had already studied. So the students came up with their own instruments, and then they designed them, drew a little picture of what they were going to do, and explained why they wanted to do that specific one, and then interacted with the materials and tested it in order to be successful. I think it was really great because they were really willing to trial and error because the whole idea was their own, and they felt really solid in the concepts that would make them successful. And I thought that was like so authentic, and just like I think when you're talking about what your students have learned or they're talking about them, people are like amazed that they've kind of internalized this so much because it's been their own from start to finish. And this was, again, all grounded. I'm a really big believer in experiential learning, so we also took a field trip to explore sound exhibits at our science center, and we did an instrument sorting with real instruments. So all these things, like they could see, well, sound is everywhere. Sound is related to everything that we do, and even outside of school, it's relatable. So I think that was really important. So I think, yeah, I just wanted to go through that and really show the process. Sorry, just to go back, I think you can use this framework for a lot of different things. I think the difference here that I've seen between this framework and other STEM activities, and I have some resources at the end for you guys, is just that this is kind of a more elongated, in-depth explanation. And what I see happening, at least in my district throughout the grades, is like these experiences that we have, in our science centers for out for a week maybe, are just kind of getting extended, and curriculum is getting more integrated into this kind of like all inclusive um, idea of inquiry. And I think that like this is a good way to kind of like bridge that gap between EC and the grades when you put this STEM kind of inquiry vision onto your PBL projects that you're doing that might be 2 to 3 weeks anyway. Um, so I think I touched on this. I just want to hit this very quickly, but I think one of the big things that I had to negotiate was, what is my role in inquiry? I don't want to design a project that students just look at what the example is and then they do it, right? That's not inquiry. I also don't want to design a project that is over my students' heads and they don't have the necessary prior knowledge in order to be successful. So I think that it's in negotiating, again, knowing your students, knowing your interests, and knowing their interests, but also like building, there's a way to build up to a point where your students can be successful while also encouraging them to be asking the questions and them to be driving the learning. And I think the best way to do that is just by modeling inquiry behaviors and language. So starting things off like testing, investigating. What if we did this? What would happen if we changed X? How would we go about doing that? And what would that look like? And I think, students will surprise you and come up with really great answers. So I think as the teacher, for me, it was just helpful to kind of let go of the end goal. I always know what I want my students to be learning, but part of the process is just modeling that thinking for students as well. And then just making sure that this experiential learning is open-ended and it offers students the chance to derive their own authentic interest. So I think, again, like if you have too much of a plan of what your outcome will look like, it will trickle down to students, and I don't think that that learning will be as authentic. And I'm speaking from kind of the first STEM project that I did, where I honestly don't think that learning was as authentic because I had such a vision of what I wanted the end projects to look like. So I think just to be mindful of that was super helpful for me. And then just to wrap it up for you guys so I can leave some room for questions, I just wanted to give you some tips and resources. So I think this whole thing has been kind of just about my learning process and my thinking and design process, but I want to give you some concrete resources. The first one from Boston's Children's Museum is super helpful for those little kind of like shorter activities. So again, what I said was this is more of like an elongated quarterly unit that I'm designing over here. But if you're looking for like those one-shot lessons to do that really build inquiry, especially at the beginning of the year when that might be an easier way for students to digest content, that has a lot of great stuff that's related to ECE standards. And then this learning from the Illinois project just has different things, again, that are really like ingrained in early childhood: measurement, block play, weather, and how you can build inquiry skills into things you already do. I think that's super important too, to think that like the thinking about STEM and how you're integrating STEM into what you already do might be that awesome first step between not being new to STEM and like trying to do a whole curriculum on it. And finally, this last point is just really great about engineering in STEM and kind of how you can encourage inquiry in your block center and engineering in general, what that would look like for ECE. And that kind of wraps it up for me. So I definitely want to leave some time for questions. Again, this is my contact info and my email at the bottom. Would be happy to kind of share the resources that I've used and even the curriculum that I've kind of put together. If you're wanting to do a project like the sound project, I'd be happy to share that with you all.
Thank you, Aditi. So if
So
you,
I guess, Kelly, just to turn it over to you. Yeah.
yep. So if anybody has any questions, just go to the question section of your console, and we will select your question as it comes in. So we'll give you guys a second to type. All right. Oh, also make sure if you have a question to type in your question in the question section of your console. All right. So we have a question. So the STEM the same as project based for the most part?
Hmm. Good question. I don't want to like speak like the expert with a yes or no answer because I would speak to my own experience, and I guess from my understanding, project-based learning is like a cross curriculum integration of different standards from different domains under the tent of a theme, and then you're exploring those. It's like instead of being skill-based instruction, you're exploring those standards in all wrapped up driving towards us understanding a certain theme. So in those ways, I see STEM and project-based learning really overlapping because, right, you're like culminating in certain projects. You're definitely involving standards from different domains, and it's hands-on, right? So I think all those ways are similar. The trip up I think that I have is that project-based learning isn't necessarily developing inquiry skills. So I think to be very concrete, like as a teacher, you could say, we're going to complete this project today. These are the directions on how to complete this project. And then you'll complete the project and you'll have gotten those skills, but you won't necessarily be investigating or questioning why or testing whether that project is like the best way. And I think that those lines of questioning and inquiry is the difference between PBL and STEM. So if your project based learning was about an investigation, then I think, and it included technology and science and math and engineering, then like that would be a project based learning activity that included STEM. But what I think PBL does not necessarily include that STEM does is that idea of being inquiry based and asking open-ended questions that where students are trying to investigate and derive their own authentic answers. That's my understanding. So I hope that was kind of clear.
Perfect. Thank you. We have a question from Vanessa Howard. Vanessa, do you want to ask your question?
I don't have a question.
Oh, I'm sorry. What did you say?
I'm sorry, I don't have a question.
Oh, okay.
Oh, no worries.
All right. Sorry. Amanda, did you have a question that you wanted to ask? Okay, so we're gonna wait for let's see. We'll wait a second for her to get back. So we have another question. So it is, can you elaborate a little bit more about what STEM looks like in a pre-K classroom?
Sure. So kind of beyond, I guess, the sound project was kind of my constructive concrete example. But I think on the day-to-day, it looks like creating these experiences and using a lot of language so that students are interacting with materials and really hands-on investigating these bigger questions. And with like teacher guidance and facilitation and asking these WH questions and inquiry questions, students are building their own inquiry learning, and building their own ideas about how things come together. So like one of the activities that we did towards building this knowledge for sound was a sorting activity with all the instruments in our classroom. We have like a big collection of different instruments, some that we've used, like African drums and other things, and some that we've never interacted with before. So that looked like, a big circle time group lesson where we pose the idea of how can we categorize these instruments? And so it got us thinking, like, how do we play these instruments? And what do we have to do to make sound out of these instruments? And it's really like you, as the teacher, like starting this conversation and then seeing where students take it. Because they'll take it, they'll know, like, we could use our mouths. Well, what are we doing when we use our mouth? It's like that back and forth. Then recording those answers, then going from there to actually investigating those instruments. Well, how would you play it? And tell us how you played it. And then where would you sort it? In a blowing, in a tapping, or in a rubbing instrument? So that's a really like simple math and science, because sound and properties of sound is a science standard too, like activity that has to do with the overall STEM that you're learning. And that's the kind of thing that they will remember when they're going to make their instrument like 2 weeks down the road and say, well, when I was sorting, I know that there were 3 ways to make sound. So I'm going to decide which one of those ways I'd like to do it. So just making sure that all these mini experiences that you're having and creating, like these projects, are building towards answering that essential question or that big idea. And I think like that's how that plays out in the early childhood classrooms. I think there's the opportunity to do these kind of things in small group, in a large group, and in centers. Honestly, in centers would be a really great time as an extension to like leave those instruments out in your music center so that students can interact with them and maybe decide to sort them in a different way. And that's them really using the inquiry that you were building to like and extend that further.
All right, thank you for that question. So we have another question. What benefits other than developing inquiry skills have you seen your students gain from utilizing a STEM curriculum?
That is a great question. I'm so glad you asked. Because I think you put in all this work as a teacher, and you believe in STEM because you have heard the benefits and these things. I think the biggest thing that I've seen is my students really being able to articulate what they've learned and how they learned it in a way that is like so genuine. Because I think the thing about language modeling is that you don't want, when a student is like kind of parroting, which I think is a developmental thing in order to really internalizing language, but when they're really internalizing the language and creating their own. And so I've just seen like the way we actually did a video for our presentation of learning of my students in our last STEM, which was all about like trees and investigating trees. And the culminating project was they built a tree in our classroom, and we used it to hang like little social emotional leaves. But all like the whole project was their idea, and they decided how they were going to build it, and then they talked about what they had to do and know to build it, and then how they decided to build it, and how they negotiated this, and when this problem came up, how they did this. And I just think like that is the kind of thing you only see when the learning is authentic and completely student driven. So I think there's a lot of dialogue, especially in early childhood, about building curriculum on student interest. And I think that's the opportunity here for STEM, is that you can build student interest and then like develop it in a way that feels really, really student centered. and they feel like they are really the drivers of their own learning. And I think we can, as educators, really see how that foundation of being the driver of your own learning will take you so far, beyond just that pre-K classroom. That to me is like the huge benefit. And then it's a great way to like frame a lot of different experiences. So I think inquiry we think about just as science, but to me inquiry is like a language component too, and language is huge for our students. So yeah.
Wow, that was a great question. Thank you again. So, do you use another question is, do you use a particular curriculum for STEM, or do you create your own lessons?
We create our own lessons. And so our district does not provide any early childhood directed STEM curriculum. And I think that was part of why, like why I'm having this seminar today, and like what the process has been to go through, is that like all the materials that we receive as a district for STEM are very much geared towards higher grades, 6th through 8th, high school. And then I feel like the challenge for our elementary teachers has been like, this is really great, but we are dealing with a different type of learner here. And we are trying to have a like more of a developmentally appropriate curriculum. And so how do we adapt these things? Because some of the foundations are really great, and I want my students to be prepared to engage in these like higher thinking STEM projects like as they get through the grades. So the short answer is no, we don't have a specific curriculum, but I do know that specific curriculums do exist. So that's kind of one of my hopes, is to write a grant in order to obtain one. But right now it's just kind of an amalgamation of what we've seen, and some of our community partners, like our local zoo does a lot of like STEM and inquiry based learning, and so they've provided some lessons and things like that. But these are really designed by us. And I will say the one benefit of designing this is that you are really thinking through the curriculum in a way that students will also be thinking through it. So I've really actually, it's one of the hardest things I've done is design these STEM projects, but it's the most rewarding when you see it kind of play out for students.
Awesome. So, what are some recommended materials to purchase if I'm starting my engineering center? FYI, I am a kindergarten teacher.
Okay. Well, great. I'm so glad you're starting an engineering center. We renamed our block center our engineering and tinkering area. So I think like my recommendation, things that I really enjoy doing with my students. So we have a lot of like wooden blocks. And I think that the wooden blocks is great because it's a good like sorting activity every time you're doing it too. It's a great way to like compare shapes. So you're kindergarten, so you're like a little beyond comparing shapes, but just like that kind of idea. What I thought was really great in our engineering center that we did this year was putting like real world examples of buildings, different types, different shapes, like of buildings that can be models for students to create, and then taking pictures of their creations and making like an architecture book out of it. Because I think the one thing that is hard at the beginning of centers, beginning of STEM, is like design thinking for students. Like I think that it can be a difficult thing to create out of nowhere. So when they have models where they can like build off of, I think that's great. So like just putting a lot of pictures in there for them to recreate different things. Another thing that I love, and I actually saw at our science center and then kind of recreated, was a gear wall. So just having, you can even make this, like having a pegboard that has like bigger holes, and then Lakeshore sells these like gears, and they're just plastic that have a little like hole that goes into a pegboard. And you can like put them together to make a big thing that moves. It's a really good like tinkering, like how can we make things connect? And you can do it a lot of different things with the gears. So I think that's a great one. And then the last one is things like marbles, I think are really great. So it's getting the kinetic sense of movement out of the things that you've built. So I think a lot of times, like, you build something in the engineering center and then it's stoic, and you don't necessarily see the function. But the point of engineering is to build something that has function. So putting things like marbles and then making like a little row that winds, and then as a teacher going into that center and say, like, well, what would happen if we made a turn over here? Would the marble still roll? What would happen if we made a ramp? Would the marble go from one place to the next? And I think those are the kinds of things where you can, like, again, interject inquiry into things that you're already doing in your classroom.
Oh, great. All right. So let's see. I think that's the same thing. What would be an example to use for 4th through 6th grade, since you use sound?
Oh, okay. I can actually tell you what our 4th graders did. They were exploring. I'm trying to think now. Living and non-living things, I believe, was one of their. I think this is the 3rd grade. So living and non-living things, and then life cycles of living things. So I know that one of the projects that our students did was talk about what characteristics living things have. So, like, how can we, I think that, so the big idea, I think, was like, how can we, like, I wish I had the specifics, but it was around living and non-living. And then they had a really cool kind of like problem-based versus project-based idea, which was to think about, well, what do living creatures need to survive, and what is the habitat that they like need to live in, kind of thing. And so doing some building of prior knowledge, and you have 4th through 6th grade, then it's great because they can do like individual research into this. Well, like, what do they need? And you talk about that and pose those questions. And then I think they designed their own living creatures that would live in the school, and then they had to pick like a habitat within the school that those creatures would like thrive in, and what were the characteristics of those habitats that were conducive to the creature. So it's kind of like, what animals live in the desert, and then like what is it about the desert that makes it a conducive environment to them. But they design their own chimeras, which are like avatars, I guess. So they got to like, this is where like the STEAM, really the art and the design comes in, where they were like measuring, well, like how tall would their animal have to be, and then like what would their animal have to have, like scales and like science things like that, and then where would they live. And so then they actually created those animals with clay, and then they went and they did like a photo documentary of their animals in that environment or habitat in the school. And then their presentation of learning was like, I think like a report and a slideshow about how they made their chimera, what knowledge they needed to have, and then why that like living animal would be successful in that habitat. So it's kind of like that. I know that they designed that project, and I think they had a lot of success. Again, I'll say because the students had this project that they had created at the end of the whole thing, and they could kind of describe like why they did it and what the learning was there, and it felt really authentic for them.
So I don't think does anybody have any more questions? All right. So if you guys have any more questions, you can reach out to Aditi directly. As she mentioned, she has her email address within the presentation. Now, in terms of next steps, so if you have any additional questions, please contact our guest speaker via email at aditi.ngarg page@gmail.com. If you would like to get professional development credit for this hour that you've spent with us, please email webinars@pageandpaxton.com, and we will send you a professional development certificate. And if you just need any other proof of your participation, please let us know what you require. And then if you want to tune in later, we will have the webinar transcript and recording available within a week from today. And the list of resources that Aditi mentioned prior, I think a few slides back, we will make sure to also send that out to all of today's participants as well. All right, so thank you, Aditi, for taking the time to put this together and share your experiences.
Thank you. I'm so glad that I got this chance, so I appreciate it.
Awesome. And our next webinar is a month from now. We're going to be talking about how you can make math hands-on in elementary education to really deepen the learning experience with math and make it more fun and less stress. So we're going to talk about that in a month from now. So you can sign up at pageandpaxton.com. Thank you again for everybody participating, and I hope to hear from you guys soon.